So I've read Kafka's Metamorphosis and it did make me question a lot of things. And so today, you are joining me on a journey through an identity crisis. As usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. Now, to understand this story better, let's actually first talk about Kafka, as his life really explains a lot. Franz Kafka was born into a Czech Jewish family in the late 19th century. He was an insurance officer whose dream was to be a writer, which unfortunately turned out to be pretty much impossible. And that's because, well, first of all, the majority of his works remained unpublished during his life, and the ones that did get published did not really receive much attention. On top of that, his father was rather an authoritarian and dominating man who did not like his son's creative nature. But all of that could not pull Franz away from literature, as he felt that writing was his only calling and desire, which is only partially true, as the man had an exceptionally high libido. Other than that, he was very self-analytical, entertaining, and absolutely truthful, but he was also extremely sensitive and had very low self-esteem, which of course led the psychiatrists to later diagnose him with all the possible disorders you can imagine. And well, it certainly did not help his case that one of his most well-known novels is a story about a salesman who turns into a beetle and has to navigate his family's growing aversion towards him. And the story's name is of course The Metamorphosis. And so now we finally begin the story, and we find ourselves in Samsa's house, precisely in Gregor's room. Here we see Gregor waking up early in the morning and realizing that while he was asleep, he had been turned into a giant bug. He notices that his back is now armor hard, his stomach is divided into bow-like sections, and he now has numerous extremely thin legs. Gregor then begins to wonder what has happened to him, and so he looks around his room, but he quickly realizes that his room remains exactly the same as before. His work equipment is still there, as well as the picture of a woman in fur, which he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine. And this picture is going to show up later in the story. Gregor then notices the rainy weather outside the window, and that makes him think that maybe he should just fall back asleep and forget about the silly situation that he has found himself in. But that turns out to be impossible, as no matter how much he tries, he's no longer able to turn to his right side, and so because of that, he's not able to fall asleep. And so he eventually gives up with that, but it's almost like he's completely blind to his new state, as the idea of being a bug does not even cross his mind, and so he rather begins to think about work instead. And this is when we learn that he's a traveling salesman, which is a pretty demanding job with lots of worries about the train connections, irregular bad food, and fleeting human relationships that are completely artificial. So as you probably suspect, he's not extremely happy about his job. So now Gregor is suddenly pulled out of his thoughts for a minute, as he begins to feel itching on his stomach. And so he lifts up his head to see the itchy part, and he notices that it's completely covered with small white spots, which were obviously not there before. He then tries to scratch them with one of his legs, but the feeling of his bug leg creeps him out so much that he just comes back to his previous position and his previous thoughts. He thinks that getting up this early turns the man stupid, and that other traveling salesmen have it so much better because they start their work later. But Gregor unfortunately has a very demanding boss, which is why everything is worse for him. But there is actually a reason for which Gregor stays in his job, and the reason is his family. Because it turns out that Gregor's family has some huge debts, and so Gregor's plan is to work for his demanding boss for the next 6 years, then pay off the debts, and then finally take a huge break after he does so. And so Gregor now looks around the room, and his eyes land on the clock, where he notices that it's already 6:30, which means that his train for work has left over an hour ago. To this, Gregor begins to panic, as he realizes that the next train leaves in half an hour, and then he panics even more after he figures that he's already late anyway. So he thinks about calling in sick, but that would be pretty suspicious of him, as he hadn't missed a single day of work in the 5 years he's been a salesman. And so he worries that calling in sick would just make his boss come here with a doctor, and after that the boss would probably just reproach his parents for having such a lazy son. And then we see how much in denial Gregor is when it comes to his current state, as he thinks to himself that, well, in some sort of way his boss would be right, because apart from a really excessive drowsiness after the long sleep, Gregor in fact felt quite well and even had a really strong appetite. But then Gregor is suddenly startled as he hears someone knocking on the door of his bedroom. And right after that, he hears his mother's soft voice coming from the living room, asking him whether he should probably be on his way to work now. And Gregor tries to answer, but he's immediately crept out by his voice, as it still sounds like his old voice, but it's now intermingled with this strange squeaking that slightly distorts his words. And so even though Gregor actually wants to explain his situation in detail, he's forced to say that everything is fine and that he will get up in a second. His mother then calms down and goes away, but Gregor is not left alone for long, as suddenly the whole house becomes aware that Gregor is still at home, even though he should be at work. And the person who immediately feels the need to do something with it is his father, who comes up to his doors and knocks with his fist, shouting Gregor's name and asking what's going on. And then his sister also comes up to his doors, but she's actually interested in him as a human, and so she asks if he's alright and if he needs anything. Gregor replies to both of them that everything is alright and that he'll be ready in a second, which makes his father go away, but his sister stays and she asks him to open the doors as she senses that something has to be wrong. But Gregor of course doesn't open the doors, and so that eventually makes his sister go away as well. And so left alone, Gregor now wonders what he should do. And he figures that he should probably just stand up, get dressed and eat the breakfast, and only then start to think what to do, because he probably won't reach any reasonable conclusions while in bed. And you may wonder, how does he think he'll be able to do all of this now that he's a bug? But Gregor is simply still in denial, as he convinces himself that, well, in the past he had those issues where he was waking up with pain, and then upon standing up the pain was no longer there, and so maybe if only he stands up he'll no longer be a bug. And he quickly realizes that it won't be that easy, as his wide body needs both arms and hands in order to get up, and instead of those he now has many small limbs, which movements he's not able to control. And so Gregor struggles by rocking himself in a steady rhythm to fall to the ground, but then he suddenly freezes upon hearing a ringing at the door of the apartment. He thinks to himself that it has to be someone from the office, and it quickly turns out that he's right. And it's not just someone from the office, but it's actually the manager himself. He comes up to Gregor's doors while Gregor finally swings himself out of the bed, making a loud noise and hitting his head on the ground. The manager then shouts that something has fallen in the room, while Greta, Gregor's sister, whispers to him from the other neighboring room that the manager came here to see him. Then we see Gregor's father and mother approaching the doors, and while the father just keeps repeating that Gregor should come out and explain everything, the mother actually tries to convince the manager that Gregor has to feel bad, because otherwise he would surely be at work right now, especially considering that he doesn't think about anything else anyway. The manager then replies that, well, unfortunately, the people of business have to simply overcome any issues they might have, and so that's not really a good excuse. To this, the father asks through the door whether the manager can come in, but Gregor replies with a simple no, which makes everyone go silent, except for his sister in the neighboring room, who begins to cry. Then after a while, the manager begins to shout through the door, yelling that Gregor is just simply causing unnecessary problems for everyone and neglecting his commercial duties. The manager then keeps, basically shaming Gregor through the door, to the point where Gregor eventually breaks and he says that he will open in a second, and then he also explains that he was not able to do that before as he was feeling very dizzy, but he's feeling better right now. And then we get an interesting description which reads, Actually, Gregor wanted to open the door. He really wanted to let himself be seen by and to speak with the manager. He was keen to witness what the others now asking after him would say at the sight of him. If they were startled, then Gregor had no more responsibility and could be calm. But if they accepted everything quietly, then he would have no reason to get excited, and if he got a move on, could really be at the station around 8 o'clock. And it's so interesting that, in a sense, Gregor doesn't really have his own reasoning, because it's almost like he just accepts as reality everything that others say. And so if for other people him being a bug would be normal, then he would just accept it and do what's asked of him. And now Gregor finally stands up, while we learn that both the manager and his family were not able to understand a single word he said. And so Gregor's mother now begins to cry, and she yells for Greta to go get the doctor, while the manager says quietly to himself that it had to be an animal's voice. And the father now also yells for the servants to run and find a locksmith. But when it comes to Gregor, he actually feels a bit more calm, as at least people now know that things are definitely not okay with him and that he needs help. And just the fact that someone already tries to help him makes him once again feel included in the circle of humanity. So Gregor now moves towards the door, and he throws himself upright against it, and he tries to turn the key with his mouth, but he realizes that he doesn't have any teeth anymore, and instead he has very strong jaws. He then struggles to turn the key, which actually damages his mouth and makes some brown liquid come out of it. And then we get such a description of his struggles. I have to read it to you. "Just listen for a moment," said the manager in the next room. "He's turning the key." For Gregor, that was a great encouragement. But they all should have called out to him, including his father and mother, "Come on, Gregor." They should have shouted, "Keep going, keep working on the lock." Imagining that all his efforts were being followed with suspense, he bit down frantically on the key with all the force he could muster. As the key turned more, he danced around the lock. Now he was holding himself upright only with his mouth, and he had to hang onto the key or then press it down again with the whole weight of his body as necessary. The quite distinct click of the lock as it finally snapped really woke Gregor up. And so after that, we are back in the living room and we see Gregor finally coming out. And immediately the manager covers his mouth with his hand. He begins to slowly move back. Gregor's mother faints, while his father at first gets angry, but then covers his eyes and begins to cry. But Gregor actually tries to behave as if everything is normal, and so he just says that he will get dressed right away and then set off to work. And Gregor then begins to frantically explain to the manager how happy he is to go back to his work, and he begins to praise being a salesman, but of course the manager is a bit creeped out, and so he turns away and he begins to make his way to the front doors. But Gregor of course realizes that he probably shouldn't let the manager go out in this state of mind, as it would probably cause him some problems at his job, and so because of that he figures that he has to first calm the manager down. And so, completely forgetting that he's now a bug that can't even speak in a way that a human would understand, Gregor now rushes after the manager. But what's actually interesting here is that at first Gregor tries to walk upright as if he were still a human, which of course comes with a great difficulty, but then after he falls down, he discovers that it's so much better to just crawl like a bug with his numerous little legs. So Gregor now chases after the manager, who quickly disappears, and right after that he's met with his father's anger. His father grabs the manager's cane that he left and a newspaper, and he begins to wave them frantically in order to drive Gregor back into his room. And this whole situation turns pretty awkward very quickly, as it turns out that Gregor has to turn around, but because he doesn't really have good control over his body, the process takes a while, and his father even has to help him a bit by directing him with the cane. But then after a minute, he eventually manages to get his head through the door, but then he figures that his body is too wide to go any further. And now there is actually a way to help help him because it's just a matter of opening the other wing of the door, but Gregor's father is so concerned with getting Gregor back into his room as quickly as possible that he just shoves him through the door, which actually makes Gregor bleed severely. And then once Gregor is finally inside, his father slams the doors shut. After those events, we find ourselves back in Gregor's room and we see here Gregor waking up in the evening. And so from this point on, Gregor starts to slowly leave the state of denial as he realizes that there is really no going back, and so he begins to explore his new form. So he wakes up and he begins to crawl towards the door, and for the first time he actually appreciates his numerous small legs, as it's of course a lot easier to crawl on them instead of forcing himself to stand upright as he did in his human form. After he gets closer to the door, he realizes that what lured him was the smell of breakfast, a bowl filled with milk and tiny pieces of bread that his sister left for him. Now Gregor is overwhelmed with joy because he actually got pretty hungry, and it also turns out that milk is his favorite drink, and so he begins to eat, but very quickly he realizes that for the first time the taste of milk is pretty nasty to him, and so he turns away in disgust and goes back further into his room. He then tries to listen to what his family is doing, but the house is completely silent, and so instead Gregor begins to think how proud he is that he was able to provide for them such a life in this beautiful apartment. But then he starts to worry, as of course now that he's out of work, this life is also about to end, and so in order to stop himself from thinking too much, Gregor begins to crawl up and down his room. Eventually he notices that his family is clearly home as he hears them tiptoeing around the house, but no one really wants to visit him, and so Gregor doesn't feel that good about it. And what's even worse is that now he begins to feel anxious from lying in the high open room, and so feeling a bit ashamed, he crawls under a couch where he instantly feels better. He then stays under the couch for the entire night, and he also thinks to himself that from this point on he should just tolerate his current state just so that he doesn't become a burden to his parents. Then after the night, very early in the morning, his sister comes into his room and she begins to search for him, and as she notices him hidden under the couch, she gets so shocked that she actually leaves and slams the doors shut, but then after a while she opens them again and comes back into the room. Now Gregor immediately begins to think about food, and his instinct makes him want to just throw himself at his sister's feet and beg for food suitable to his new tastes, as otherwise he will surely just starve to death. But because he's too afraid of being a burden, he just stays in place and wishes for Greta to figure that out herself. As she does, she notices that he barely drank any milk, and so she picks up the bowl with a rag because she's too disgusted to do it with her own bare hands, and then takes it out of the room to find something more suitable. In a minute, she comes back with an entire selection of food spread on a newspaper, and on it we can find some half-rotten vegetables, bones covered with white sauce, some raisins, almonds, and dry bread. And so she puts it down on the ground, and then she also puts on the ground the bowl that she took before and fills it with water. And it's also interesting that this bowl is described as almost contaminated in her eyes from this point on, and so because of that it's just permanently given to Gregor. Is this even the meaning that I wanted to have? So weird when English is not your first language, because sometimes I have some words in my head and I think that they mean something, and then sometimes they actually mean something else. So you can never be sure. And then in order to make Gregor feel more comfortable, Greta actually leaves the room and locks it. He quickly crawls towards the food and he begins eating it with his eyes watering with satisfaction, and he realizes that all the fresh food is not really that tasty to him, but everything that's rotten is far more pleasurable than he would like to admit. After the meal, he hears the key turning in the lock, and so he crawls back under the couch while his sister comes in and she begins sweeping everything from the floor, even the fresh food untouched by Gregor, which in her eyes is now contaminated. After that, Greta leaves the room, and we learn that from this point on, she begins to bring Gregor food like this twice a day, once early in the morning when everyone is still asleep, and the second time after the dinner when once again everyone is asleep. And it's explained that she does that not because their parents want Gregor to starve, but just because they've been suffering enough already, and so learning that their son now eats nothing but rotten food probably wouldn't make them feel better. And so we now see Gregor in his room, and he's actually pressed against the wall, as lately he's been trying to listen to every single conversation his family has. And it turns out that they are pretty much just confused and scared. Confused because they don't really know how to behave, and scared because they're afraid of leaving the apartment completely empty. On top of that, up to this point they actually had a servant girl, but after this whole situation with Gregor, she begged them to let her go and promised that she won't tell anyone about anything, and so they of course agreed. And now we move for a moment to the living room, and we see here the whole Samsa family except Gregor, of course, and they are talking about money here. The father is of course the one initiating the conversation, as he lays out how their financial situation looks like, and then he grabs a small logbox and from it he pulls out some documents. And it turns out that this logbox is actually something that has remained from Gregor's father's business that has failed 5 years ago. And this piece of information is very important because the failure of that business was actually what pushed Gregor into the career of a salesman, and from that point on, providing for his family became his only concern in life. And in the beginning, everyone was of course very happy about this whole situation, and there was this special warmth in the family, but of course after some years Gregor's mother and father became used to the idea of him being the only provider, and so because of that they became a bit distant emotionally. The only one who still treated her warmly was his sister, and so in order to kind of like thank her for that, Gregor came up with a plan to send her to the conservatory next year, as Greta loves to play violin. And so even though it would require a lot of money, sending his sister to the conservatory became Gregor's biggest dream. Now, going back to the father talking about finances, it turns out that they actually have a small fortune from the old times, and not only that, but they have some larger savings from all the money Gregor has been bringing to the home, as Gregor was only keeping to himself the necessary amount. And after Gregor hears about those savings, he actually rejoices, which kind of doesn't sit right with me, because like, what do you mean he was sacrificing basically his whole life to be the only provider for his family, as if they were starving? But like, it actually turns out that they have a pretty nice fortune, and it's even like said in the book that true, with this excess money, he could have paid off more of his father's debt to his employer, and the day on which he could be rid of this position would have been a lot closer, but now things were doubtless better the way his father had arranged them. I don't like it. It's not fair. But yeah, Gregor is really only thinking about his family's well-being, and so you can imagine his panic after he hears that the savings would only last for 2 years. Because of that, the family figures that it will be better to set those savings aside and earn the money needed for everyday expenses. That information, of course, worries Gregor greatly, as his father hasn't worked in 5 years, his mother has a very bad asthma, and his sister is only 17 years old, and so she's only used to just helping around the house and playing the violin. And so eventually Gregor begins to feel so much shame whenever he hears his family talk about money that soon he's not able to listen to them anymore. Following that, we learn that a month has already passed since Gregor's transformation, and he's still a bug, but now he's becoming more aware of all the changes that his body is going through. His eyesight gets pretty bad, bad to the point where he's no longer able to see things clearly, as whenever he looks out of the window, instead of seeing the urban landscape, he sees the gray skies and the gray earth blending together. And now Greta is of course still taking care of him, and she's being very compassionate, even though she can't help but get a bit startled whenever she sees him. And Gregor of course is aware of that, and so one time he actually drags a sheet over the couch so that when he hides under it, he's no longer visible. And his sister is of course very thankful for that. And then when it comes to Gregor figuring out how to live in the body of a bug, he actually begins to have fun. And that's because one time he gets pretty bored of just laying down on the floor and eating the same food every day, and so he figures that he can actually crawl back and forth across the walls and the ceiling. And his most favorite thing becomes hanging from the ceiling, as it's easier for him to breathe, and he also gets this nice pleasant vibrations going through his body whenever he's up there. Now Greta quickly notices this new habit as Gregor leaves lots of sticky fluids on the walls, and so she figures that maybe it will be better to take some of the furniture out of the room in order to give him more space to crawl. But she's not able to do it herself, and so not really having anyone else to help, she eventually involves their mother. And the mother is actually pretty excited about this, since she's been wanting to visit Gregor for quite some time now, but everyone kept forbidding her from doing so. But now, upon seeing his mother, Gregor actually crawls further under the couch, as the only thing he wants to do now is to disappear. And so the women then begin to take the furniture out of the room, with Greta carrying some of the heavier stuff, despite her mother warning her about straining herself. And then after they are done with most of the furniture, they actually have a small disagreement. And that's because the look of the empty walls hurts the mother's heart so much that she asks Greta whether, by removing all of the furniture, they're in some sort of way giving up all the hope for Gregor to return to normal. And Gregor of course hears this, and it really makes him think, as he's now thrown into a mental battle between his old identity of a human and the new one of a bug. And so he thinks to himself, was he really eager to let the warm room, comfortably furnished with pieces he had inherited, be turned into a cavern in which he would, of course, then be able to crawl about in all directions without disturbance, but at the same time with a quick and complete forgetting of his human past as well? Was he then at this point already on the verge of forgetting, and was it only the voice of his mother, which he had not heard for a long time, that had aroused him? Nothing was to be removed. Everything must remain. In his condition, he couldn't function without the beneficial influences of his furniture. And if the furniture prevented him from carrying out his senseless crawling about all over the place, then there was no harm in that, but rather a great benefit. But now, even though his mother still perceives him through his own identity of a human, and Gregor suddenly wants to remain in it, his sister is not really excited about the idea, as she's of course the one who sees Gregor every single day, and so in some sort of way she thinks that she's an expert on him. And it's said that it's of course not only her recently gained self-confidence that leads her to the conclusion that the furniture should be taken away, but also the fact that she just sees that Gregor clearly needs more room to move, and so perceiving the reality through his old identity is just simply useless. And so they begin to take the rest of the furniture out of the room, while Gregor actually begins to panic, as he really doesn't want everything to be taken out, but at the same time he's not going to come out from under the couch, as that would definitely scare his mother. And so he's now going through a big emotional turmoil as he sees the women taking out his writing desk, the same one he used since elementary school. And so they then leave for a moment, and this is when Gregor finally breaks, as he comes out from under the couch and he begins to frantically look around the room to pick what to save, and then without much thinking he just rushes to the picture of the woman in fur and he covers it with his body. The women then come back, and Greta is actually the first one to notice Gregor on the wall, and so she immediately tries to take take their mother back to the living room. But this of course makes the mother very uneasy, and so she looks around the room, she notices Gregor, then she yells, "Oh God," and she faints. Greta then runs to the living room in order to get some medicine to bring their mother back to consciousness, while Gregor thinks that it's an amazing idea to help Greta, and so he runs to the living room after her. Greta is of course not extremely excited after she sees Gregor behind, and so she just grabs a couple of bottles with medicine and then she runs back into Gregor's room and she shuts the doors behind. And so now Gregor is left alone in the living room, worried that his mother is probably close to death and it's all because of him. And because he's of course not able to open the doors to his bedroom, he begins to just crawl over everything here, and then after he gets exhausted, he falls onto a table and begins to wait. And then after some time, he finally hears a ring at the door, and then he sees Greta coming out of his bedroom and opening the front doors. And the person who comes in is their father. Now, Greta immediately hugs him and says that her mother has fainted and that Gregor has broken loose, which the father interprets as Gregor has attacked the mother. So the father says that he has actually expected that something like this would eventually happen, and then he gets extremely angry and begins to search for Gregor. But now Gregor, on the other hand, gets a bit shocked upon seeing his father, as the last time he saw him, he was an old, exhausted man who was moving very slowly and could barely stand on his own without a walking stick. But now he's standing up straight, he's dressed in a very nice uniform, his eyes are alive and alert, and in general he seems to be more capable than ever before. And he definitely is, as right after he notices Gregor, he begins to chase him around the room, and then eventually he also starts throwing apples at him. And one of the apples actually hits Gregor so hard that it gets stuck in his back, and in this moment Gregor is really ready to give up, but then he suddenly sees his mother opening the doors to his bedroom and escaping from it, and so Gregor then rushes towards the empty room and locks himself there. Now, after all of those previous events, Gregor is painfully aware that there's no going back to his previous life, and not only that, but everything becomes even worse. And that's because for the next month, the apple that his father threw at him remains in his back, causing a nasty wound that doesn't want to heal. And what's the worst about this is that Gregor's movements are now incredibly limited, to the point where it's very hard for him to even move to the other side of the room. But it's not all bad, because at least his family starts to kind of pity him, and so every evening someone opens the doors to his room just so that he can stare at his family and listen to them talk. But of course, he's not allowed to fully participate, he's only allowed to just lie down in his bedroom in complete darkness and observe everyone from there. And as he's doing so, he notices that the family seems to be pretty calm and quiet, but that's only because everyone is now exhausted. His father often falls asleep in his armchair after he comes back from work. His sister studies for her new job as a sales girl, while his mother sews lingerie that's going to be sold later. But the situation with money is still pretty bad, as they have to replace their previous servant girl with an older cleaning lady, and on top of that, they also have to sell all of their jewelry. And they also talk about wanting to move to a smaller apartment, but that of course is pretty much impossible, as they would have a big problem with transporting Gregor. And so Gregor of course realizes that he's now pretty much just a burden to his family, as even his sister is not as compassionate as before, as she usually just tosses him some food in the morning, which he barely eats now, and then she sweeps his room in the evening, doing so as quickly as possible. And it's also noted that even though she sweeps the room pretty regularly, what is this word? Regularly. I love English so much. And so it's also noted that even though she sweeps the room pretty often, she won't clean anything else, and so because of that, Gregor's room soon becomes extremely filthy. But then, interestingly, as one time his mother decides to clean his room, Greta becomes extremely offended by it, and so she argues with her mother, and she tells her that this is her responsibility to take care of her brother. And another interesting thing here is that as they argue, Gregor is only able to think about the fact that they left the door open, and it makes him very irritated that they do not think about his feelings. Which actually becomes a theme for a moment, as Gregor now often complains to himself that the family is neglecting him. And it gets even worse because after that argument, his mother is no longer allowed to enter his room, while his sister, being extremely exhausted after work, grows tired of cleaning his room, and so she stops coming completely. But fortunately, Gregor is actually saved by the old cleaning lady, who begins to come to his room pretty often, and what's interesting is that she's not at all afraid of Gregor, she's rather interested in him. And so she often opens his doors unexpectedly just to catch a sight of him, and she even tries to talk to him. But Gregor is actually not that excited about this whole situation, as one day he even tries to attack the cleaning lady, but to this she just grabs a chair and she threatens him with it, not at all afraid. Then, as the family continues to have problems with the money, they eventually rent one of the rooms in the apartment to 3 lodgers. And those guys really don't tolerate any clutter or useless stuff, and so because of this, lots of furniture is now moved to Gregor's room. Which is kind of interesting because it's almost like Gregor's room now becomes this place for everything useless, implying that he himself is also useless and doesn't belong to this like active life of the family. But going back to the lodgers, we now see them in the living room sitting down and waiting for the dinner. Then the mother enters with a dish of meat, and right behind her, Greta enters with a dish piled with hot potatoes. They set the dishes on the table, and then one of the lodgers begins to examine it by cutting off a small piece and checking whether it's tender enough. Fortunately it is, and so the mother and the sister now leave, relieved that they don't have to prepare a new batch of food. The lodgers then eat in silence, while Gregor actually watches them from his dark room as the cleaning lady left the doors open, and he laments to himself, how is it that they are eating while he is starving? After some time, the lodgers finally finish eating the meal, and this is when they suddenly hear a violin playing in another room. They begin to listen pretty attentively, and then they ask Greta to come to the living room and play for them. So the father then comes in with the music stand, the mother with the sheet music, and Greta with the violin. She begins to play, and the one who's the most enchanted by the music is of course Gregor, who now moves a bit forward, not at all caring that his head is now visible in the living room. But the family doesn't pay any attention to that, as they are rather concentrating on the music, while the lodgers on the other hand quickly become disappointed with the performance, and it soon becomes clear that they are listening purely out of politeness. But Gregor is still completely enchanted by the music, and so he crawls a bit further, and we get such a description. It reads, "He was determined to press forward right to his sister, to tug at her dress and to indicate to her in this way that she might still come with her violin into his room, because here no one valued the recital as he wanted to value it. He did not wish to let her go from his room anymore, at least not as long as he lived. His frightening appearance would for the first time become useful for him. He wanted to be at all the doors of his room simultaneously and snarl back at the attackers. However, his sister should not be compelled, but would remain with him voluntarily. She would sit next to him on the sofa, bend down her ear to him, and he would then confide in her that he firmly intended to send her to the conservatory, and that, if his misfortune had not arrived in the interim, he would have declared all this last Christmas, and would have brooked no argument. After this explanation, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would lift himself up to her armpit and kiss her throat, which she, from the time she started going to work, had left exposed without a band or a collar. But Gregor's vision, of course, doesn't come true, as suddenly one of the lodgers points his finger to him as he's now fully visible. The music then stops. The father immediately runs up to the lodger and tries to calm him down, but it turns out that he's actually not scared, as he's rather entertained. But despite that, the father still tries to push the lodgers into their room, which actually makes them a bit irritated, as they now realize that no one has told them about Gregor. And so, as the father still tries to push them, suddenly one of the lodgers stands hard on the ground and declares that, considering the horrible conditions in the house, he cancels his room and won't pay anything for the previous days, and will even initiate legal actions against the Samsa family. They then leave, and the father falls onto his chair while Gregor actually stands still, both from the fear of the consequences and also the weakness caused by his severe hunger. Everyone then sits in silence for a while until eventually Grete breaks it, saying, "My dear parents," said the sister, banging her hand on the table by way of an introduction. "Things cannot go any longer in this way. Maybe if you don't understand that, well, I do. I will not utter my brother's name in front of this monster, and thus I say only that we must try to get rid of it. We have tried what is humanly possible to take care of it and to be patient. I believe that no one can criticize us in the slightest." And now her father agrees with her, while her mother begins to have an asthma attack. And so Greta then repeats in tears that they just have to get rid of it, because she sees how much its presence is killing everyone in the house, especially considering how much they have to work now. Her father then replies that if Gregor understood them, then maybe they could have some sort of compromise, but that of course is impossible. And so Greta then continues, saying, "It must be gotten rid of. That is the only way, father. You must try to get rid of the idea that this is Gregor. The fact that we have believed for so long, that is truly our real misfortune. But how can it be Gregor? If it were Gregor, he would have long ago realized that a communion life among human beings is not possible with such an animal, and would have gone away voluntarily. Then we would not have a brother, but we could go on living and honor his memory. But this animal plagues us. It drives away the lodgers, will obviously take over the entire apartment, and leave us to spend the night in the alley. Just look, father," she suddenly cried out. "He's already starting up again." And so she then hides behind her father, but Gregor actually doesn't want to cause any problems, and so he just turns around with the intention to go back to his room and leave the family alone. And so he then makes his way back to his bedroom, with his family watching him with sadness and sorrow, but then right after he disappears, his sister slams the doors shut, bolts it, and then yells, "Finally." Following that, we move back to Gregor's room, and we see him lying down on the floor, motionless, as he discovers that he's not able to move, but at the same time, he slowly feels all of his pain going away. And what's actually heartbreaking is that in this moment, he thinks about his family with a deep feeling of love, as it's revealed that the idea that he has to disappear is probably stronger in him than in his sister. And so he stays in this state of peaceful reflection for some time, and then eventually his head falls all the way down and he lets out his final breath. After that, very early in the morning, the cleaning lady comes in, and at first she thinks that Gregor is just playing around, and so she tries to poke him with a broom, and that's when she realizes that he's actually dead. And so she opens the doors, she yells that it has died, and then soon after we see the father father, the mother, and Greta coming in. The cleaning lady shows them that Gregor indeed is dead by poking him again with the broom, to which the father then says that they can now give thanks to God, and after that everyone crosses themselves. And they now notice how thin Gregor's body is, as even though he was receiving food, he was barely eating anything. Then after a while, the family eventually leaves the room, and soon after, the lodgers enter, surprised that they did not receive the breakfast yet. To this, the cleaning lady shows them the dead body of Gregor, but before they are able to react, the family enters again. Now, the father immediately tells the lodgers to leave the apartment and never go back, and at first they kind of want to argue with him, but after they notice how serious he is, they agree and leave. Now, following all of that, everyone eventually leaves Gregor's room, and then after that, the cleaning lady informs the family that she took care of Gregor's body, and then after so many months, the family finally leaves the apartment together. They then take a train to the countryside, and while they are traveling, they talk about their future. And it turns out that their financial situation is actually not that bad, because everyone is employed now and they have pretty promising prospects. The only thing that has to be changed is the apartment, as this one was found by Gregor, and now they need something smaller, cheaper, and better situated. And so while they're wondering about this, suddenly the parents notice how much their daughter blossomed into a beautiful woman, and that makes them think that they should probably find a good, honest husband for her. And with that, we end the story. And so, that was the whole story of the Metamorphosis. Now, before we talk about this concept of an identity crisis, I unfortunately have to first be a bit annoying and ask, what do you think identity even is? Because I've been actually kind of wondering about this, and it kind of seems to me that identity is just what your mind is the most used to in the current moment. And so, at least in my opinion, it's kind of like this story or like an anchor that kind of like lets your mind navigate reality in an easier way. So you can see that, for example, in the beginning of the novel, Gregor's identity was being a salesman and a provider for his family. But that identity was kind of like created in his mind because of repetition, in a sense. Because for the last few years, every single day, he was living the life of a salesman and a provider. And so he was waking up early in the morning, traveling for work, coming back home late, and paying for everything that his family needed. And so by repeating that every single day for the last couple of years, and also by repeating it in his mind, so that, you know, when he was thinking about himself, he was thinking that he is a salesman and a provider, his mind kind of like took that as a consistent story that it can rely on. And so by rely, I mean that his mind kind of like knew how to react to the world and also like what to expect from it. So yeah, as usual, I have no idea. Like, I don't know, but it just kind of makes sense in my head that identity is sort of like this program that your mind operates on, and that's created through repetition. But I think that it's important to note that this program can be flawed, so like it doesn't necessarily reflect reality, because like think about this from this perspective. 5 times in your life you were brave, and then 1 time you were a coward. Now, if you never recall those brave moments in your life, but you just constantly keep repeating this one moment when you were a coward, chances are that your mind is going to take being a coward as your identity, even though in reality it's not really, but your mind, through repetition, believes that it is. And so now I don't know, but I think that identity crisis happens when this program in your mind gets kind of like disrupted in some sort of way. And it's either because you want to disrupt it, because you maybe want to change something, or you are forced to, because in case of Gregor, he was of course forced to, because suddenly he was a bug, and so living his life in a previous way to which his mind was used to was just simply impossible, and so he had to develop something new. And I think that it's also very interesting how in the very beginning his mind was still kind of like trying to operate on this old program that he had, And so he was essentially trying to do everything as before, you know, like get up, get ready, go to work, and even do it in a human way by standing upright, even though his body only allowed him to crawl. And so I think that identity crisis is sort of like this moment when your old program in your mind is dying out and you basically have to create a new one. And this process can be pretty distressing, I think, both for you and for the people around you. But I think that it's mostly like a human nature to be kind of distressed by a change because, you know, when the environment around you is predictable, then it's safe. But when something suddenly changes, then you don't really know what to expect, and it kind of can make you anxious. And so when someone is suddenly changing, then it can be pretty distressing because like now you don't really know what to expect from them, and you just don't really know how it's going to play out and how life is going to look like and your relationship with them. You're just kind of like in the darkness with that. But with time, as you explore the unknown and kind of like learn how to navigate it, I think that, you know, you kind of start to develop this new program and you get used to it, and people around you also get used to it because now they know what to expect, you know, like it's different, but they know what to expect. So it's kind of like safer, even though it's different, it's now safe because now we know what's going to happen and how everything is going to play out. Or at least this is my interpretation, both about reality and the book. So yeah, I don't know, you know, I don't know. I'm just giving you some thoughts from here, and that's really it. But now I think another interesting question is, was Gregor still Gregor? If his body changed, his routine changed, and even his senses changed, was he still Gregor? And well, the answer really depends on your beliefs. So yeah, but I believe that Gregor was still Gregor because I believe that what truly makes you you is just your consciousness, just like you being aware of the things around you and in you. Because like in the same way, I think that I could ask you who is currently watching the video, whether you are also the 5-year-old you. Because like, you know, everything changed, your body changed, your mind changed, your emotions changed, like everything changed about you. And yet still, when you look at the pictures of yourself when you were 5 years old, you say that it's you. But like really the only thing that is truly still here is just you being aware of being in this body, like your consciousness. So yeah. But that's just how I see stuff. Maybe you see stuff differently. You can write me down in the comments if you do. And now, third question, because I have a lot to say about this novel apparently, is who was really the bad guy? Because I read that some people think that Gregor was actually bad because he was very like overbearing and controlling, and he basically made his family feel as if they were incapable in some sort of way. But I would say that we actually don't really have any bad characters in this novel, just lots of confused ones. Because it is true that Gregor in some sort of way caused his family to be helpless and a little bit lifeless, but at the same time he was never malicious with that, quite the opposite. He was always putting their happiness above his own. The real problem was that he did not really know what happiness was, which happens in life quite often. And then when it comes to his family, I don't think that they were bad. I think that their biggest issue was that they really lacked communication and they had a lot of misunderstandings, which you can see numerous times, especially with Gregor's father, where he reacts literally without a second thought, just because he makes an assumption about what's going on. So yeah, I would say that the whole Samsa family was not very good at talking about the important stuff. They were rather imagining a lot and just making assumptions. Now, the last thing that I want to mention is more for the people interested in Christianity, because I think that when we're talking about identity, it's very important to mention the concept of taking identity in Christ. Let me tell you that when I first heard about this, I was literally in heaven, but then I started to get more into it, and it unfortunately turns out that this exact sentence with those exact words does not really appear in the Bible. But the idea is still nice, it's just that it's more of a conclusion than a direct verse. When it comes to the actual verses from the Bible, then we have two of those. Like, there's actually more, but I just picked two. So I'm going to read them to you. The first one is, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And then the second one is, so if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. So my interpretation is that when you become Christian, like in your heart, then you kind of like let your old identity die out and you form a new identity in Christ alone. So like, for example, when we see in the novel that Gregor had his identity in being a salesman, then he was basically like thinking from the perspective of being a salesman. So like, you know, how a salesman would behave, what he would do, how he would feel, stuff like this. Just like how to live life as a salesman, basically, how to react as a salesman. Blah 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 blah, you get the point. But once you take identity in Christ, then it's almost like now you should think about what Jesus would do, think and feel, and you should also like train your mind into doing, thinking and feeling what Jesus would do, think and feel. I don't know, and it kind of sounds insane because like I do realize that because it kind of sounds like you're just brainwashing yourself, you know, like what am I supposed to just forget about my old identity and basically let Jesus take over? But you know what, when I came to those conclusions, I also thought that this is a bit insane, but then I was like, you know what? Why not? Let's do a little experiment on my mind. And you know what? This is really what solidified my belief in Christianity, I think. Maybe it's not like the only thing. There's also many other things. But this is one of the biggest ones, I think. Because when I did this, it was really like something that I never experienced, I think. And let me tell you that this is not the first time that I kind of do some sort of like experiments on my mind and stuff like this. Like, that's normal here. And what really bought me was that when I did this, it kind of felt like I was no longer confused about reality. Like everything was so clear all of the sudden. Yeah, like I've never experienced something like this. And as I said, like experiments on my brain, that's like normal stuff for me. So yeah, that was something special, definitely. And it didn't last for long because like it's pretty hard to behave like Jesus and just because it's also like not only about what you do, it's also I think more about how your mind kind of like takes reality in and how it reacts in a sense. So it's not just about doing stuff, you know, it's actually more here, like how your mind works. Because, you know, you can help someone and then you can have very, very bad thoughts about them. And so I think that then that's not really what Jesus was doing. So it's definitely more complicated. And I still try to have this approach of like, you know, thinking and feeling and behaving like Jesus, but it's not simple. Like it's extremely hard. So yeah, let's say that the experiment kind of ended, but I'm still trying to do it. It's just like I'm kind of more chill about this now. So yeah, I personally believe that taking identity in Christ is probably the best thing that you can do for yourself, because it really does comfort the heart, at least for me. I don't know. I hope that it does for everyone. I think that it does. It has to. But now, after all of that, I hope that you don't think that I'm insane. Maybe you do. You know, if you do, then that's fair. Yeah, but this is really everything that I had to say, so thank you so much for watching, especially that you're watching till the end. You can subscribe to the channel, that's going to be very, very nice of you, and bye-bye!